Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the very good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program and welcome you to today's session that we've entitled Reaching Out at Rio, Population Growth, Family Planning, and Environmentalists. As per usual with our programs here at the center, we are mixing communities, mixing topics, trying to better understand analytical links, trying to better understand collaborations or the lack thereof among different communities, and put them in policy contexts where we can not only understand these issues but try to act on them. And so it is a great pleasure to have that same mix at the table today under a larger frame that, as we all know, is the sustainability and development imperative that will be under discussion at Rio Plus 20 in June. I think those of you who are veterans of some of the dialogues we have here at the center that have for many years now been supported and done in partnership with USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, currently under our HELPS project, our Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security, again going with the theme of it's all gotta be there, even if it's a long string, a long list. But in that context, discussions we've had here is trying to understand the analytical links between demographic and environmental and development issues, variables, and then also where there are synergies and opportunities to cooperate, and when it's not happening, what are impediments to that, and some of the challenges associated with that. And so it was in that context then that we had a conversation actually in Dakar in November with some different folks, but a similar frame at the International Family Planning Conference. Had a very productive discussion, and kind of came back and said, well, what would this conversation look like in Washington if we wanted to try to engage on some of the same themes? And so we're very fortunate to have a very interesting panel to do that today, and it's terrific that we have such a good turnout for you all to participate in this conversation. So we will start with Nancy Belden. Actually, we've also imposed on Valerie DeFilippo, who's head of Americans for UNFPA, to say a few words to set the scene for our first presentation, which was kind of asking the question here domestically: how do these issues play together or in running in parallel, but can we find ways that they can intersect the women's empowerment and health and population family planning issues and engage the environmental community, or those who are identifying themselves as environmentalists. So some very interesting polling data and focus group work that engages that community on these issues and tries to better understand how they see them. And so we're very much looking forward to that. Nancy, as I think many of you know, is the founder and partner in Belden, Rusinella and Stewart, a polling firm, and has really focused on these issues topically and with these tools. And so bringing that expertise together, we very much look forward to that discussion. And then we thought it would be interesting and appropriate to hear from one of the NGOs, big domestic environmental NGOs, that has been and is engaging on the interaction of these two topics in these two communities. And so Kim Lovell, who heads the population and environment efforts at the Sierra Club, is going to tell us about how they do that, what have been some of the approaches they've taken, and how they have succeeded in bringing these topics together. I think many of you, again, who have been here before know Kim has been at Sierra since '09, working, we're pleased to say, with one of my colleagues here who is now here, Sandeep Pathala, who was a colleague of Kim's before she came over and joined our team here at the Wilson Center. So Kim's going to tell us about the Sierra Club experience in this space. And then Kate Shepard has agreed to kind of reflect on their presentations and these two topics. Kate is a journalist. She's at Mother Jones. She's previously at GRIST. She is one of the very few people, I think, who actively sees her beat as including all of what we're going to discuss today. Typically, it is one or the other, and very few of either. And so it's terrific that she will come back to us, because we had a very interesting discussion just last year focused on how journalists cover these issues. and reflect on covering these issues and some of the challenges and what she's heard today. So, in fact, Valerie, if we could turn it over to you first, and you and Nancy can tag team that first presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Valerie DeFilippo. I'm president of Americans for UNFPA. We build political and financial support for the United Nations Population Fund, which, as many of you probably know, really exists to make sure that every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and that every young person fulfills his or her potential. Obviously, core to that effort is to make sure that we meet the unmet need for contraception and achieve universal access to reproductive health care. I'm up here not to take more time on side issues, but to explain why Americans for UNFPA would have commissioned this research a year or so ago. We, as many of you here, were involved in discussions about what was the real meaning of the milestone that was approaching us, and that was when the Earth's population reached 7 billion. We wanted that discussion to be more than about strength in numbers, but really talk about the linkages that exist among the environmental, women's health and reproductive health, and women's empowerment movements. And what we discovered in those initial discussions, that population was often a stumbling block. It was the language we used around population was an issue across all the movements. And so we wanted to at least, knowing that everything was linked and understanding that even if we chose not to work together, we did share a common agenda, believing that every individual really should have the chance to live a life of health, dignity, and prosperity. We thought it was really important to find ways that we could enable the communication rather than inhibit it. So we asked Nancy Belden of Belden Rusinello Strategists to undertake this research, and we hope that this discussion today will lead to a more nuanced understanding as we are approaching not only Rio Plus 20, but the 20-year anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development, the deadline fast approaching for the Millennium Development Goals, as well as the new emerging discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals that will replace the MDGs. So with great pleasure, I turn it over to Nancy. And thank also our funders. I shouldn't forget to thank Summit, Wallace Global, Goldman, and Prentice Foundations for their support of this research.
Great, thank you, everybody. I think this probably changes my. Can I do it from here?
Yeah, I just need to bring you up.
Now, and I can probably make these go forward, right? Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. A million years ago, when I was a young person, I wrote my master's thesis on the history of family planning in Mexico. And then I worked for Planned Parenthood, and I worked for the Methodist Church on population and family planning issues long before I went back into my father's business of polling. So I share a lot of interest and concern about these issues, and I'm delighted to have been working on this project. Just so I have a little sense of the crowd, how many people here work for a foundation? Anybody? Any foundation people? A few people in the back. How about some NGOs? How many people are with how many are those environmental? Anybody in environmental groups? Anybody in population specifically groups? Some of the same. Okay. Government. A lot of government people. Okay. Did I leave anybody out? Small private business? Okay, a little smattering. Okay, well, good. So let me tell you a little bit about what we did here. Let's see if I can make it go. No, I turned it off. Okay, there it is. There we go. Okay, got it. It's the forward button. So we were asked to look into this project because as you all know, sometimes the idea has been that sort of population is toxic, that we can't talk about population growth, that would be a problem, even if we think it's an issue. So a consideration for this project was, can environmentalists be engaged in the issue of population and of population growth, in the issues of family planning, of international voluntary contraception, and the intersection of these two issues. So we set out to look at that and all this. Do these things connect? Do people see a connection? Are they interested? What can environmentalists be engaged in these issues, and if so, how? And secondly, I guess some of the how would we mobilize them? What would be the things to talk to them about? And how can we craft ways to talk about that? So what we did some focus groups in last year, and we followed that with a survey. The survey used a probability sample that's developed by something called Knowledge Networks, which is an online a system, but it is based on a true probability sample. So it's not like your usual, anybody who wants to sign up gets on the poll, on a sort of poll. So it's a probability sample, and out of that probability sample, we pulled people who said they had donated or volunteered for an environmental organization in the last 12 months. So that's how it was our definition of environmentalist. So what did we find? Well, I'll tell you very briefly. I'll give you a little overview, and then we'll look at some stuff in a little bit more detail. First is that environmentalists prioritize the environment, of course, as you might imagine, of the issues that they care about and might get involved in, but they also will give us a higher priority to all the things that we talked about that had to do with women and empowering women over a concern with population. Population is there, but it's not as high as the central concern they might have about environmental issues per se and empowering women. So we're going to talk about that a bunch. But the population pressures are seen as an environmental problem by them. They don't dismiss it as not being something real. Although, depending on what are the particular parts in the environmental issues that we talk about, does seem to help when we want to communicate about them. So the strongest framework that we could come up with, bringing all of this together for engaging people in the issues around voluntary family planning and contraception, focuses on women and on what's good for women and empowering women. But environmentalists are ready to talk about population. They're ready to listen. It's not toxic. They're not driven crazy every time you open your mouth about it, okay? So you have there's a lot of good news in here and some issues about how to link those things. So let's look at some of the stuff we talked with them about. First of all, we asked them about their support for foreign assistance. We use the economic assistance question, U.S. providing economic assistance, because that's a classic question that's been asked over many, many years, and we can track attitudes about that. And as you can see from this, 63% tell us that they support U.S. providing economic assistance to other countries. Not a lot of them very strongly, only 12% strongly in that category. Nevertheless, a much bigger number overall than you would find in the general population. When we ask in the second set there about whether they supported U.S. contributing to a UN program that provides for voluntary access to contraception in developing countries, we get even a higher number. Now, this is a classic thing in surveys that when you offer a specific, you often get a better number. So it's an important thing to think about in communicating and talking about things, that when you can actually describe what it is, particularly something as popular, it turns out, as this, you're better off. You reach more people. And how we get half saying they strongly support that kind of assistance, but would be a good place to put American dollars. Now, when we ask them about the environmental issues that they're really concerned about, not surprisingly, what rises to the top is something like renewable energy. The only numbers I'm showing you here are the people who gave these different issues a 10 out of a 1 to 10. If we included 8, 9, and 10, you would have much bigger numbers. So don't freak out that don't think only 28% care about renewable energy. But we do this in order so that we can see a ranking. Otherwise, the numbers sort of wash out. All right. So topping the list is development of renewable energy, and right there with it is helping protect other countries' environments. But right next to that is human rights, and then health conditions, and then access to voluntary contraception. So these are very good numbers to start with, all right? But you can see if you go down the list, slowing population growth starts to be a little bit less important. It's still up there, it's not bad, but it's a little bit less important. And again, when you speak to the human interest part, the specific about actually providing something for people, like contraception, you're going to do a little bit better. So remember, our audience here is environmentalists. And as environmentalists, they're largely liberals. All right? They're more liberal than the general population. They're going to put things like encouraging democracy in other countries, fighting drug trafficking, stuff as a lower priority. This is going to be their mindset. Now, digging a little more deeply into this, we looked at a question that asked, and I'll read you the question because it's sort of hard to see here, about outcomes. What people thought would be the outcome of providing of contraception, voluntary contraception. Because we asked, among the list of outcomes of providing voluntary access to contraception you just read, which they had seen a list, or they'd already been asked about, they marked the top priority to achieve. All right? So what do they think? Oh, I'm sorry, this one doesn't show up entirely on the right-hand side. It basically says, we just start at the top, that improving living conditions for women and their families comes out very tops. In other words, if we provide family planning, voluntary contraception, what do you think is going to happen? What would be the outcomes? All right. The top thing that people said was living conditions for women and families is going to be better. The second one is slowing population growth, and the third one is ensuring women have options and can make reproductive decisions. All right. So, I'm sorry. We asked what would be their top priority. What would they like to think that they're supporting? So if you take those, the first one and the third one together, and we have to, you don't add 45 and 43 because some of these are the same people, right? Picking those as top priorities. You get half. You get 47% of the environmentalists saying something about women and empowering women and improving the lives of women as what they would really like to see as an outcome. All right. You get population up there. You see that they think that would be a good thing to happen, but they also have that family planning, the women's frame around it. They also believe that it's real, that truly offering voluntary contraception will in fact have impacts. They think that people will adopt and do want it. So we asked whether or not they thought these things would make a big difference, some difference, not much difference in if family planning, if contraception was available. So ensuring that women have options and can make reproductive decisions tops the list. They think that's an easy, apparent, obvious outcome to people. But so is slowing growth. So they see, and so is improving the lives of women and families, reducing deaths and unsafe abortion, and securing human rights to decide childbearing. All of these things come out as very realistic, apparent outcomes they believe in. So it's the takeaway here is that they think that women's lives and families' lives and children and ultimately men too are going to be improved. They also think population growth will be slowed. They see it. They get it. Okay, so also we were interested in this inquiry, of course, as to whether the UN and the UN and UNFPA and others were actually actors that would be appreciated in the field. And first of all, the UN people think is an appropriate actor in this area. The focus groups affirmed that the UN is the right place, the right kind of organization to be involved. It seems the right place to go. That's fine. UNFPA, as you might imagine, nobody knows what UNFPA is, so it's not as if we presumed that they did. But we described to the focus group participants UNFPA's mission, and they were very supportive of that, reacted very positively to it, and largely because it had that focus on women and improving their lives, their health, and so forth. So they were strong actors there. We were also really concerned whether or not, go back now to this question of, is population a toxic issue, all right? So we put two choices on the poll. We did what we call the forced choice question. People to choose, you force people to choose one side or the other, whether they like it or not. They have to pick one or the other, right? So we asked them, we basically just changed the question on one side slightly. On one side we said, which of the following campaigns would you be more likely to support? One that focuses on changing consumption habits and developing clean energy, or one that focuses on changing consumption habits and developing clean energy as well as slowing global population growth? Well, 80% chose the one that included slowing population growth, right? So just one more piece of evidence that they're ready to think about it. And I also must say this, and I think this will be an important issue for all of us. The focus groups made clear, and I'm sure you all have this discussion all the time with people, that if we didn't loop in the consumption part, they got nervous. If you don't talk about consumption in the same breath, they start wanting to put it in there, because otherwise they do go back to their old, population bomb, Paul Ehrlich. This is somebody telling people something, blaming the developing countries, blaming others, if you don't talk about our consumption habits, right? So we didn't focus on a lot in this, but it's a very obvious thing from the focus groups and from this. That's why we put it in that. We put consumption in that part. So I would never forget that. Okay, so this top framework, as far as figuring out how to talk to environmentalists to get them engaged on these issues, the top framework really does focus on women. And it works because a bunch of things that we've seen, and I'll just sort of reiterate them. First of all, women's issues, women's development is a top priority for U.S. assistance to developing countries. When we said where would you like to see investment go, women's issues tops the list. They're also a high priority outcome for providing international voluntary contraception. They think that's a really good place for it. Why we would do it is to help women lead better lives. They believe very much that voluntary contraception can help women, and that a winning message with environmentalists, especially those who are very likely to be proactive on the issue, deals with women. So I'm not going to read all through the language here. I think you guys have it as a handout. So we developed from all of this the language that we thought was the most appropriate. There's a secondary framework, and it is but it's environment, population, consumption sort of framework. All right. Because environmentalists do see population growth as a threat, so it is a viable way to talk to them. It's not their first inclination, but it's not going to fail. It's not going to go unheard, and we have language for that as well. So, in conclusion, environmentalists are a prime target for trying to get funding into international programs. I didn't mean that they're primed to be funded, that they would support our investment in that. They're also they're likely types of people to become actually activists. And while human rights is the top priority for some of these, and it's an important concern in the focus groups, neither of these frameworks do as well, neither the human rights or the environmental stuff, as those the human rights and some of the other issues that we tested just don't do nearly as well as the focus on women and the focus on environment and population growth. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Nancy. As we said up front, we're reaching out to Rio Frame. This is an opportunity for us to understand some of these foundational questions, foundational links, and obviously helpful then when we are, as we've had discussions here, discussing how these issues could connect to that broader development agenda. And we thought, as I mentioned up front, it would be terrific to hear from one of the NGOs that has been making these links and obviously has its eye on Rio as well. So, Kim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. So I'm Kim Lovell. I'm with the Sierra Club's Global Population and Environment Program. And I'm really excited to be here today to really talk about how this research is sort of a case study and Sierra Club is really a case study for how this research is real, is true, and really speaks to the importance of environmentalists integrating these concepts and how the Sierra Club has actually had a lot of success doing that, integrating population, reproductive health, women's rights, and climate change through our work at the Global Population and Environment Program. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about who we are and what we do. Then I'm going to go into a few case studies of things that our volunteers, the youth that work with our programs, et cetera, have actually done on the ground in their home campuses and communities to integrate all of these concepts together and really work on population, reproductive health, and the environment in tandem, and how they've had success doing that. So the Sierra Club's mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. We are the oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization in the United States. We've been around since 1892. We do a lot of the things that you would think a traditional environmental organization would work on, protecting communities, wild places, the health of plants, animals, and people. So essentially what we do is we work on sustainability. We work on making sure that we have a planet that is healthy for future generations. We work to practice and promote the responsible use of the Earth's ecosystems and resources, educate and enlist humanity to protect and restore the quality of the natural and human environment, and use all lawful means to carry out those objectives. So what does this sustainability mean? If we're working to ensure a sustainable planet for future generations to come, we have to think about consumption and population. And about 40 years ago, the Sierra Club realized that population was a really important piece of ensuring the sustainable planet for future generations. So that was when the Global Population and Environment Program was born, when we realized that this link was really important. The Sierra Club was already doing a lot of work to address that consumption side. So we wanted to address the other side as well, so that we could really talk about both sides of this coin. The Global Population and Environment Program works with domestic and international partners to foster healthy communities by advancing sustainable development solutions. It's kind of a mouthful. What does that exactly mean? So what do we do? So the first thing the program works on is increasing access to voluntary family planning and comprehensive sexuality education for men and women and families around the world. Why do we do that? Sierra Club believes that we don't only have the right to clean air, clean water, a clean environment, healthy food, but we also have the right to decisions about our own childbearing and family size. So that kind of falls in place with the human rights framework that our organization is based upon. But besides that, we also believe that family planning and increasing access to family planning for women around the world is a climate adaptation and climate mitigation solution. Many of you are familiar probably with Brian O'Neill's research, which came out in 2010, which really showed that meeting the unmet need for family planning for the 215 million women around the world who would like access to contraceptives but don't have them currently, that simply meeting that unmet need could reduce up to 16 to 29% of emissions. So meeting that unmet need essentially would bring down our emissions by 16 to 29% and be a step on getting us towards emission stabilization. So that's huge, right? Giving women something that they want is something that would be a climate mitigation solution that's cost effective and that promotes human rights. Besides that, we also believe that meeting the unmet need for family planning is a climate adaptation solution, recognizing that climate change is already happening and that women and families around the world are suffering from the effects of water scarcity, of erratic weather patterns, et cetera, and that when women have the ability to plan their family size and have more choices about their families and their reproductive health and rights, that it makes it easier to adapt to those climate change effects that are already taking place. The second thing we do is we advance basic rights for women and girls, including education and economic opportunity. As many of you know, there's a direct correlation between fertility rates and literacy rates. the more educated women are, the more access to education young girls and women have, the smaller families they choose to have, those families are smaller and healthier, et cetera. So we really believe in some of the tenets of what this research showed, that promoting women's empowerment is an effective strategy when looking at climate and the environment, but also is important in its own right. And environmentalists believe that. The third piece is this piece about reducing consumption. As the research showed, it's extremely important to talk about consumption when you're talking about population, so that people don't think you're only working to address one of those pieces, but recognizing that this is sort of a multi-sectoral approach that we need to be looking at both. As many of you know, the United States makes up 5% of the world's population, but we consume 25% of the world's resources. So especially as a domestic environmental organization working on this issue within the United States, it's really important to recognize and address the effect of Americans and what's happening here on the ground in terms of our consumption rates when we're talking about climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, and thinking about strategies to mitigate and adapt in the future. And the last thing we work on is empowering youth. Our youth program is an extremely important tenet of the work that we do. Over 50% of the world's population right now is under the age of 25. So the reproductive health decisions that young people are making today are really going to have huge effects in the future in terms of the sustainability of our planet. So working with youth to make sure they understand these links between population, reproductive health and rights, and the environment is really important. So I wanted to give some sort of small examples of things that our activists, Sierra Club members, youth with our program have done to integrate all of these various themes together in their work and their own activism. And I pulled a couple of quotes out from the actual research that kind of demonstrate how our activists have been doing this and why. So the first one, this is from the packet that you guys all have. It says, environmentalists are concerned about environmental degradation. They believe that population growth has a negative effect on the environment, especially on the availability of scarce resources. And they believe that contraception can make a big difference in slowing population growth. This picture up here on the left in front of the White House is our youth fellows. We train a group of 20 youth fellows each year to be making these sort of cross-sectoral links in their work, to go back to their campuses and understand how health and rights are related to the environment and climate change, and help them take action on those issues. And this picture below is an example of an activity that one of our youth fellows implemented on her campus that's called Resource Water Pong. Has anyone heard of beer pong? Anyone in the room? Okay, popular college game. This youth fellow took the concept of beer pong, something that is popular among college students to play recreationally, and turned it into an activity that you could organize around population and the environment. And what she did is she set up this game so that each team would represent a country and their water availability, and that would be how many cups you have. So for example, one team would represent the United States, where we have almost complete access to water and sanitation. That team would have 10 cups on their side. The other team would represent a developing country that had less access to water. One of the places where women spend up to 26% of their day simply gathering water to use for their families. That team would have much fewer cups than the team that represented the United States. So their cups would represent their amount of water access. Well, when you think about playing a game, if anyone knows how beer pong works, you throw ping pong balls across to try to land them in the cups, and as you land it in a cup is removed and you essentially score a point. And when you have no cups left at the end of the game, you've won. Well, Team USA is at a huge advantage when playing this game because they only have the other team's 3 or 4 cups to make when playing the game. They have more access to water, they have the advantage. The other team, the team that represents a developing country with less access to water, has to make all 10 of the United States cups, that full water access. So they're at a huge disadvantage when playing the game because they're going to lose since they have more cups to make. So as this game is going on and we're talking about water access, this youth fellow brought in the issue of climate change and how climate change has affected water access. Then she started talking about family size, and when you have more children in a larger family to provide water for, the longer distance you have to walk and long distances that you have to walk to get that water, the more time of your day you're spending gathering water for your family, the more of those resources you need. A lot of times when you need help gathering water for your family, who do you think is being used to help you? Children, and which gender of child? Girls, exactly. So now you can see how that's affecting girls' education and access to economic opportunities because they're spending time in their day helping their mother gather water to feed this big family. So she really tied in these concepts of water, climate, the environment, and women in a way that was fun for young people to participate in and to act out while they were coming to understand these concepts at the same time. So that was a really cool sort of strategy she used. This picture up at the top right is a couple of our activists and one of our Sierra Club board members at the March for Women's Lives that was here in DC in 2004. Their shirts say pro-choice, pro-family planning, pro-environment. And we had a huge contingency of Sierra Club activists who took part in this march, really representing the linkages between women's empowerment and access to reproductive health care and how they as environmentalists really care about that issue, and it means a lot to them in their own work. This pop art on the left is a really cool activity that one of our youth fellows started this year, where he started an art competition on his campus in 2011, which is the year that we hit 7 billion, as was mentioned before, where he asked artists, local artists and artists on his campus, to depict what 7 billion means to them. What does hitting that number mean in terms of resources? What does it mean in terms of agriculture and nutrition? What does it mean in terms of women's health and rights issues? Really, whatever they wanted it to mean to them, he solicited artistic representations of this through this pop art. If anyone's familiar with Andy Warhol, pop art, sort of a play on words, population art, pop art. So it was a really creative way of him getting the artistic community involved and making these links as well, in addition to the environmentalists and reproductive health advocates on his campus. On the top here, we have one of our Sierra Club activists in California who has been a little bit frustrated with the contraceptive debates that have been happening around the country in the past few months and weeks, and decided that she and her population group at the Sierra Club wanted to talk to people about this and talk to people about the fact that contraceptive access is not just an issue for women. It's not just an issue for young people. It's an issue for everyone. And as environmentalists, we have a stake in this as well and really care about access to these services. So she dressed up as a giant condom and went out at an environmental fair in her community and passed out information and literature about the connections between these issues, and had huge interest in this, and a lot of people getting really interested and intrigued why an environmental group would be dressed up as a huge condom, but also really coming to understand and really make the case for why these issues should be connected as she spoke with people at the environmental fair. And this last picture on the bottom here is a presentation that we gave at Georgetown University in Texas last year. This is a small college just outside of Austin in South Texas, where they're experiencing a lot of water scarcity problems. You know, the American Southwest has had some droughts and erratic weather patterns of their own in the past couple of years. And so this student wanted to have a presentation on reproductive health and the environment and population that again brought in the issue of water access, but talked about it in a way that was local and domestic. A lot of times when people think about water access issues, they do think about that, contingent of women abroad who have trouble gathering water, or it's far away and they have to travel long distances to get water. But this is really an issue increasingly in the United States as well. And water scarcity and water access is something that is specifically students in the American Southwest really care about right now. So she brought that connection into this presentation that she called Sex and Sustainability, that talked a little bit more about reproductive health and rights and how they're linked to climate. So our membership gets it, essentially. These links, these connections that are being made that have been proven through this research is something that at least the Sierra Club environmental community really understands and is energized by and excited by and wants to work on. But one of the problems we see sometimes when volunteers or a grassroots group of folks are interested in an issue is that to really gain traction, you need people at the leadership level to be making these connections and understanding how they're linked as well. And that's something that, in part, due to the research that was recently released, we have had success in encouraging Sierra Club leadership specifically to really take on this issue and make the links for the broader Sierra Club membership and environmental community, as these people are environmental spokespeople in the United States and around the world, and helping them to understand these connections and showing them through the research that this is something exciting and interesting for environmentalists has been really important. So this clip on the left is called The Importance of Population in Protecting the Planet. It was written by the conservation director at the Sierra Club, Sarah Hodgson, and featured in her weekly blog on Tree Hugger. And this gained a lot of traction because having the conservation director at Sierra Club, who's working on coal issues and natural gas issues and protecting lands and all of these other things that we work on, coming out and saying that when we're talking about sustainability, when we're talking about protecting our Earth, population and reproductive health and rights is an essential part of that. So that was huge and really exciting that she took that issue on. On the right here is an article that was co-written by Carmen Barroso of IPPF and Carl Pope, who was the previous chair of the Sierra Club, pointing towards the future, how environmental and women's rights groups can work together to solve global problems. And this came out around the day of 7 billion and was really a neat opportunity to show the links between these two different movements working on various facets of this issue, really coming together and talking about how they as leaders and the activists within their organizations are excited about this link. So Rio. I want to end by saying a few words about Rio. I was lucky enough to be in a part of the Durban Climate Conference, COP17 in Durban a few months ago, where I had the opportunity to meet with the U.S. lead negotiator, Jonathan Pershing, for the U.S. delegation to the conference. And this was a big meeting of U.S. young people. There were about 150 young Americans in the room that he agreed to meet with and talk to about climate change, about the conference itself, and where we were headed. And one of the things that he said as part of his little presentation was that he really wants to hear from young people about solutions, that he's tired of hearing people complaining, these negotiations are not accomplishing enough, all these summits are not doing anything. He said the louder and more vocal you are with tangible solutions for adapting to and mitigating climate change, the better. So I raised my hand and I said, I have a solution, one that the United States has actually been stepping back from their commitment to in recent years, and that's international voluntary family planning, and talked about the mitigation and adaptation effects that meeting unmet need for family planning can have, and really challenged him why the United States is sort of shirking in their commitment to this, and why this conversation hasn't been coming up much in Durban. And Pershing admitted, rightly so, that population is an important part of this puzzle. He talked about the IPAD equation, the Kaya equation. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that. Impact equals population times affluence times technology. So basically, when we're looking at human impact on climate, it's a function of those three things: population, affluence, technology. Affluence and technology kind of make up that consumption piece. Population is the third piece and one that's essential, and he did say that. But then he said these issues are too controversial to come up at these international conferences. And I don't think they will be raised because different countries have varying opinions on them and it raises a lot of controversy. So in this venue right now, I'm not sure how much you're going to see of that. Take it to Rio. He said that. He said, take this to Rio. Rio is about sustainability. Rio is about moving forward on a sustainable path and looking at nutrition and agriculture and sustainable cities and all of these different components that make up creating a better future for our planet. So that was really encouraging to me, and I think should be really encouraging to all of you who are working on this nexus, that there really is opportunity there. I think that the research that just came out will be helpful in demonstrating that environmentalists and the environmental community really have potential to engage around this at Rio and beyond. So that was kind of a positive note that I wanted to leave you all on. And this is just a quote that someone posted on our Facebook wall a couple of weeks ago. I've always been thankful to the Sierra Club for understanding the importance of reproductive rights and women's rights and protecting the environment. Thank you. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. Now we're going to turn to Kate Shepard from Mother Jones for some reflections. Wherever you feel. Let's go.
I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll stay down here. I guess one thing I was going to start off and say is that my title is technically the environmental reporter at Mother Jones, but sort of in the last year and a half, I've had reproductive rights added to my beat for a variety of reasons, one of them being just the number of people we have in Washington and how much has been happening on this issue, and we really need more people covering it. But in general, I mean, I'd say I tend to cover environment and reproductive rights, and the overlap is not necessarily always there or always clear. Maybe 10% of my stories actually somehow reflect that overlap. But I think that's okay. I mean, we actually have a separate environmental blog, but it's like environment research. We call it Blue Marble. It's basically about how we live on the earth, and that includes, for us, reproductive rights and family planning issues and health and sort of a whole variety of things that are sort of about basically the future of life on Earth. So we kind of treat it as integrated in that we cover it in the same space in our digital pages, which I think is sort of an important way of thinking about it. So even if you aren't doing a bunch of programs, if you're an environmental group and you're not doing all your environmental programs that have something to do with reproductive rights, at least if you have some part of it that touches each other, I think that at least helps communicate the message that these things are related challenges. I had a few just sort of points that I wanted to raise. I'm somebody who, a lot of you work for government or foundations or NGOs, and I take in all the messaging that you guys put out all the time, and then I sort of have to figure out my way around it and put it out to the world in a news or magazine format. So I sort of get to think about the messaging kind of a lot and think about how my readers respond to it. And we have a pretty active dialogue with our readers. So this is sort of just my thoughts based on covering these related issues. One, I think I'd say I think it's important to talk about it in terms of family planning and sort of that empowerment model of, you're helping women and their families make a better life for themselves. And I think that terminology is pretty important to keep in mind because, if you're thinking about population growth, that term, you're thinking about the effect, not the cause. Rather than, the problem is just not that the number's going up. The problem is that we have all these other problems that are causing the number to go up, and that people don't have access to education and research. You want to make sure we are targeting the causes and not just the outcome. I think that's just important to remember in your whatever messaging you're putting out there. I also think it's interesting. I was just reading a really great New Yorker piece about the history and current state of Planned Parenthood. And it actually had a really fascinating part where they went through and talked about why the terminology with which we talk about this has changed over the years. Basically because sort of, if you think about the terms we use sometimes, like birth control or like population control, like that control word is like a buzzword. It's like a touchy term. And like there's a reason people have tried to, move toward terms like family planning because it sort of conveys a more positive message about what it is that you are trying to help other people do. And I think it also has that sort of more empowering language and talks more about sort of like the issues related to access to services and access to education and resources. The other point I'd say is that I think it's really important, and I think Nancy made this very clear, is that you need to talk about consumption as well, and that's an important message to include when you're talking about it, because it's not simply a problem that the numbers are of us who live here on the earth are going up. It's a problem of how people, especially here in the U.S., live, and there's been a lot of sort of harmful messaging out there from certain segments of the pundit sphere about the problem is that the U.S. population is growing and we should throw all the people from other countries out. Well, no, the problem isn't that people are coming from other countries. The problem is that people are living like Americans, and Americans use a lot more resources than everybody else. I think that's sort of just important to keep in mind when you're thinking around not just here in the U.S. but looking around the world at other countries as well. And I also think it's very important to keep in mind that when you're talking about that, you sort of need to realize that like a lot of people in other countries want to live like Americans. Like we have pretty nice lives compared to what a lot of people live. And so you need to also sort of make sure you're thinking about how you convey the message of like using less but still having a high quality of life, and just sort of being smart about how you communicate around consumption issues as well. I think another thing sort of important to keep in mind is that when we're talking about these issues, we can't just talk about family planning, access to contraception, education. It sort of also needs to be about the broader related portions of that conversation, which are about health, basically. It's about making sure that their maternal health is better and that women who, if they don't want to have kids, they don't have to. And if they want to have kids, they can do it in a safe way, and that they have access to the things that will make sure that they have they themselves are healthy and that they have healthy children. And I think that's sort of just making sure that part of that conversation is there as well, kind of communicates more aptly why people are interested in this work. And that includes also HIV and AIDS education too. When we're talking about this, it's not just, when we're talking about access to contraception, it's not just for preventing unwanted pregnancies. Is also about making sure that people who in vulnerable communities have access to HIV, STI prevention methods as well. And another thing I'd say is that here, one thing I've taken away from covering this issue is that the allies are very clear. I mean, the people who really care about environment are generally a lot of the same people who really care about access to contraception and birth control and family planning issues. I mean, it's sort of just natural allies. They tend to be pretty on the left of the political spectrum here in the U.S. They're a ready audience to hear about these connections, and they're a ready audience to take action about them. And if anything, I've realized that people, that when you're talking about reproductive rights issues, the reaction is much stronger. Like, I've written about environment for years and years. When I started writing about reproductive rights, people cared. Like, people wrote to me. I've gotten way more feedback from people who read our magazine. People sending letters, calling, because it's something that they very much deeply connect with. Most women, most men too. I mean, have understand why it's an important issue, and they've understood it in their own life, and they have a very strong response to it. And I think that's why you've seen, with the fights over Planned Parenthood here in the U.S., people have very strong feelings about it on either side of the spectrum. But it's something that people really do care about, and they understand, and they can feel at a personal level. And I think that's something that translates. I think a woman who understands why it's important in her birth control and access to family planning is important in her life will understand why it would be important to some woman who lives in, Kenya or, Indonesia. They'll understand that because it's something that they can very much connect in a way that sometimes environmental issues are a little bit more distant and not quite as clear to them on a daily basis. So I think that that realization that that these people are already politically active and engaged and are ready to hear that message is important, and that it's something that really just resonates very clearly with people if you talk about it in a way that makes sense in their life. And then last thing I could say is I would like to convey that there should be people should be aware of some of their own assumptions and cliches that are used in talking about some of these issues sometimes. I think a lot of times I see messages about international family planning issues that seem to have this kind of assumption that women in other countries don't necessarily know about it and that they're totally ignorant and uneducated about this. And I've found in my own reporting that a lot of women, they know what this is, and they know that they want to have access to it. They just don't have access. And so it's just sort of important to keep in mind the sort of stereotypes we bring when we're talking about these issues. Another thing is with climate change as an issue, I feel I often hear these sort of, there are all these concerns about, resources and, tensions over resources leading to violence. But I think it's also sort of a bad idea to keep putting out messages that people in other countries are violent and scary, and if we don't do something about climate change, they might come kill us. I think that's not a very positive message to be putting out there. And so I think there just needs to be some more sort of awareness about how we message around those issues if we're going to actually get people to care about it in a meaningful way. I guess those are my big takeaways.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kate. Well, I thank all of you. As we set it up, we obviously had some different slices of some of the same questions, trying to understand the links and the ways to talk across these different communities and productive ways to do it, and how some of what may be dominant frames or intuitive frames may not actually bear out in terms of closer inspection from efforts and the youth examples that were provided from Sierra Club and some of the wider frame polling. Certainly interesting across all three of you, the reflection of kind of what is and isn't seen as a appropriate or common tool for problems, the kind of going side by side. And I think part of what this is facilitating a conversation that tries to understand the links and tries to find ways that in some ways we have a broader notion of what are appropriate tools in the toolbox to tackle these challenges that may be framed on either side, but with the coming Rio Plus 20 are framed in a global sustainability frame that has brings up a quick set of these are the issues and these are the tools we use to respond to them. But frankly, given some of the difficulties that we've had since the original Rio in 92 or the Stockholm in 72, we have not made as much progress as we'd like. And that suggests that we, as Kate has said, look at our assumptions carefully and critically, and perhaps provide greater room for a wider set of frames and interventions for tackling these vexing challenges. So we appreciate this setup. We have plenty of time for Q&A. My colleagues, we have microphones. We have a very full room, so we ask for your patience ahead of time of getting the mic to you, but we want to make sure everyone can hear your question. If you could let us know who you are and pose a question. Many of you could make speeches because you're very knowledgeable, but we'd prefer that you not make a speech here, that actually just pose a question. And perhaps given how many people we have, what we'll do is we'll collect a couple at each time and then give our panelists an opportunity to divide and conquer in responding to them, and so that we maximize the opportunity for conversation with all of you. Apologies for my bad eyesight for those in the back, but why don't we try? So, Kate, why don't you grab a couple there, and then Kaylee, you can bring the mic, and we'll get these folks down here in front.
I'm Jason Bredman from Population Reference Bureau. Thanks for the panel. I have a quick question, which I asked when we were in Senegal to a similar panel, which is, what is it that we're asking for at Rio? So take this to Rio as the message, then I think we have to be more specific about that. What is it we're asking within those negotiations? That's the question. The second, if you'll allow me, Jeff, is a quick comment on messaging. The messaging on 215 million women and unmet need, as it's written on the slides, and Kim, as you're talking about it, are slightly incorrect, and I think it's important to get them right. And as a demographer, I feel like I have to stand up and say it. It's not 215 million women want contraceptives and don't have access to it. The numbers don't say that. That's not how they're calculated. They're correct here, and it's correct in the brief on talking points. So it should be 215 million women around the world want to avoid or postpone a pregnancy but aren't using contraception. The reason that they're not using contraception, the reasons are very diverse, and they aren't simply access. So there are a lot of women who have access to contraception but aren't using it. And it can be for family reasons, cultural reasons, many others, myths and misconceptions about contraception. So this is the right one. Take the brief home with you. I didn't write it, but it's got it correct there. Sorry.
Terrific. Thank you, Jason. Kaylee, you have a couple here.
Hi, I'm Heather Heckel from American University. I actually have two quick questions. The first one is, do you plan to do a similar survey of people who are passionate about reproductive rights to see if they could then become strong environmentalists, particularly since you, Kate, mentioned that people are so passionate about that issue? And then the second question is also about your findings. I was struck by how few people connected reproductive issues to climate change in your survey. Kim, I love the examples of how you all are attempting to address that, but could you speak a little bit more about why we're missing that connection, why passionate environmentalists are missing the climate change/population connection?
Okay, Kate, why don't we go back to you? We'll kind of ping pong here.
Hi, my name is Diego de Leon. I'm an American University student, and I have really two quick questions. One is regarding, we're seeing in the developed world that reproductive rights are widely accessible, and but on the other side of the spectrum, we're seeing a growing aging population. So it's the opposite of what's happening on the developing world as what's happening in the developed world. So I'm just curious, if you've already have some research on that, and what is your opinion as workers in the population, academic area, of the aging population, which is the other side of the spectrum rather than the newborns. And I guess that's pretty much it.
Terrific. Kaylee, we have another one down here.
My name is Peter Knight, former World Bank, and live a good bit in Rio, so I'm interested in this. I noticed that you're talking about consumption. It seemed to be mainly in terms of numbers rather than per capita. And given economic trends in Europe and the U.S., other things may be forcing some reduction in consumption, but the whole ethics of consumption and so forth in the developed world, seems to me it's very hard to promote this in countries like Brazil, which are undergoing a demographic transition anyway quite fast. But there's always this feeling that, okay, you're trying to hold us back, and you guys are consuming so much. So until there's some change in values here and corresponding activity, I think that would be difficult, and I'd be interested in doing it. The other question is, there's a lot of talk about polling in the U.S., but what about polling abroad?
Okay, terrific. Why don't we take those four, and then we'll get to another round. I appreciate, again, your patience. Nancy, you want to start?
I'll address some of the polling issues. Polling on reproductive health, reproductive rights, polling abroad. How can I say that more research is not needed? We'd love to do that, either of those. There is a lot of very interesting stuff international that the Pew puts out, and some other, and some within USAID, but I don't have it. Let me just address a little bit of the question about climate change. When we did the focus groups, we were stunned and sort of truly stunned that a number of people that we had recruited who were presumably environmentalists, they gave to environmental groups, they volunteered for them, were almost climate change, global warming deniers. All right? We were very alarmed by this. I think that, and I've done a lot of work for other clients, environmental groups, always, but a lot of things recently as well. I think that's starting to change. But I think even among environmentalists, people are a little afraid. They're trying to be politically correct. They're a little afraid of talking about it. And that's one reason why the consumption thing comes in so nicely, because it sort of puts back the conversation on things that we're all doing that might have, whether or not you think the impact is climate change, everyone still can agree on it. I'm not sure why it doesn't work quite as well, but I do think that's starting to change. Or I did until some of the Republican candidates started to tell us that it was we didn't care about people, we just cared about Mother Earth. But it's still, the whole climate change, global warming discussion is still very sensitive. There's an enormous amount of denial that still goes on. The interesting thing on messaging, when you want to simply get your point across or get people activated on your issue, is that you don't need to go there. You'd like to go there. You'd like people ultimately to be educated and go there, but you don't have to go all the way to say it's actually happening. People care about these issues, just because they care about air quality, they care about people's lives, they care about families' lives, they care about water, they care about all those other things. So you don't think that because you can't put it very effectively, particularly to a broader audience than just environmentalists. Don't be too anxious at the moment that you can't go there. Hopefully it's coming around, that people will get clearer and clearer about what's going on. But meanwhile, you have a lot of other things to say to people that will have the same impacts, and that they appreciate and accept as truth.
Sure. Go ahead. Sure.
So I'll try to address a couple of these questions. First of all, what are we asking at Rio? What do we want? I think my opinion of that question was informed heavily by being in Durban, where there was a lot of efforts to get gender into these documents, to get gender written in to the language coming out of Durban into the formal agreements themselves. But it kind of stopped there. It was, let's get gender in. Let's make sure that, women are part of these discussions and are part of climate adaptation and mitigation solutions. And yes, we want that. That's great. But we can't stop there. I think we need a formal inclusion of, language talking about reproductive health and rights and population as something that's going to affect and be affecting development that is sustainable, and that's really hinging on that. So I think one thing I would like to see is sort of moving beyond this gender framework, which is great, to make sure that when we're talking about gender, we're talking about women and women's inclusion, that also takes up reproductive health and rights access in a formal way at the negotiations. To address the climate change question, why it's so easy maybe to make this link when we look at resource pressure or, some other environmental issues, but when we talk about climate change, why is that hard? I think that really gets back to sort of the history of the population movement, if you will, and people don't want to sound like we're placing blame for climate change on the backs of women. I mean, that's not what we're doing. That's not what this is about, but I think that there is sensitivity to that because of Ehrlich's population bomb, because of this idea, in the 60s and 70s that we needed to bring down population so quickly, or we were all going to run out of food. I think people are really sensitive and are uncomfortable making the climate change link because they think that by talking about climate change and population and reproductive health and rights, that we are placing blame, which is not obviously what's happening. I think that bringing in adaptation is a really important part of sort of getting over that hump and talking about the fact that access to these services is an adaptation solution as well as a mitigation solution, and not focusing just on that mitigation side, I think is really helpful. But that's a difficulty and a struggle that we face with our membership, as people who care about women's empowerment, who care about rights and access, as we all do, not wanting to make that connection because of what it might connotate. And the last thing I would say with regards to the aging population, the average. Does anyone know how old the average Sierra Club member is? Anyone in here? 23. Not 23. Nope. Over 50. Yeah. So it's.
Are you suggesting that that's old?
No, I did not say that. What I am saying is that there is a lot of investment amongst, what one would call an aging population in creating a sustainable future for their children, for their grandchildren. We've had a lot of success in mobilizing older activists around this issue because they care about the effects on that 50% of the world's population that's under 25. And I think when you start talking about people's kids and people's grandkids and what they're going to have to raise their families on, this becomes an issue that is really salient among older populations. I know that's not exactly what you were asking, but I feel like I have to mention that as a Sierra Club representative, that we've had a lot of success with older populations in talking about this. So I'll pass on.
I think we have the same challenge at Mother Jones. I think our average readership is in their 50s in the print edition. But the web is now in their 40s, which is a positive development that people are somewhat younger online. I was going to say, I wanted to address Peter's question, which was a little bit more what I was sort of talking about, and sort of talking about consumption and how hard that is. And I think I definitely have seen that in the environmental community, people are really scared of approaching that issue in a lot of ways because it's sort of like you don't want to tell Americans that the lifestyle they lead is bad and that like they can't have the nice things that they like. It doesn't necessarily fly very well, right? Like I understand why people kind of have shied away from that, but that doesn't mean we need to like avoid the topic totally. I mean, what I have found in just like writing about this is that people want to hear positive solutions and they want to hear about what the alternatives are, and they don't want to hear the alternative is sitting in the dark wearing a hair shirt and eating bugs. Like they want to know that like you can live a nice life and consume less resources, and sort of telling the story of great examples of that, like what cities are doing or what other countries are doing, like sort of German solar success story is great. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people in the U.S. who don't want to hear about, like, they don't think Europe's awesome, but there are a lot of really, like, positive stories about how things Europeans have done, or even things that here in the U.S. that have been done that aren't, necessarily come with a whole lot of suffering. They are still very positive and actually, make communities better and make them more resilient and make them more sustainable. And so I think it's important to make sure that those positive stories are told as well.
Sure. Thank you. Why don't we do another round of questions, and Kate, we'll start with you. I would make one other connection on the aging one, which is Kim mentioned the Brian O'Neill research on emissions. Part of what's really interesting about unpacking that research is he also looks at what the carbon emission implications are for an aging population, for a more urban, and so it's not just numbers and carbon. It is where they are. And it turns out, of course, the older population, as they move out of the workforce, actually their per capita emissions go way down. And so it has some interesting stories of aging population. Of course, it depends to some degree where they are, but for the most part, that means fewer emissions. And so in that sense, it gives you a much more nuanced story that again, behooves us to be more precise in trying to understand some of those dynamics.
Just one other thing on the population. In the environmental survey, it's actually the younger cohorts that are the most interested. All right? Everybody's interested. They are environmentalists, but in every crosstab, it's the under 35 crowd that rates the highest on almost all the measures. So there's hope for engaging them.
Kate, do you have? Yeah, please.
Does this work? Yes, it works. Hi, my name is Natalia Costas, and I work for the Gender Office of IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. So we're an environmental organization that's actually comprised of member states, over 180. And for us, population is very much a controversial issue, so we don't focus on it. My office doesn't focus on it because of that, because it's so controversial, just as much as it's controversial in the negotiations, because many different countries who are our members would have different positions on that particular issue. But I wanted to ask if you know of any countries who openly support it and sort of are outspoken about it, who would be willing to take this forward on the road to Rio. We are also members of the women's major group, and we've included population in the women's major group submission to Rio, but the negotiations text is being put together right now, and the window closes actually on February 27. It's the last deadline that countries can support their input for text, and once it closes, probably no new language will be added in. So it's important. And the way this works, it's really you have to have some countries that are outspoken in the negotiations and talk about it.
Very good question. Thank you. Kaylee, why don't we got a couple down here in front. Okay, I promise we will get to you guys. Go ahead.
I'm Kristen Patterson with the Nature Conservancy's Africa program. And I just, more of a comment than a question, but I just wanted to thank you very much for doing the polling and the results and sharing them widely. I've been working in the integrated PHE field now for about 7 years, and my approach has always been to lead with the women's health message, and it's fascinating to see that actually it would be better for U.S. audiences to lead with a women's empowerment message. And so I just wanted to thank you for sharing that. The Nature Conservancy is in the process of, we've launched an integrated PHE program that also addresses climate change adaptation in Western Tanzania. And we're in the process of reaching out to our 1 million donors in the United States, sort of sharing this project as one of our more innovative projects that we're working on. And it's going to be interesting to see what the response is from our members in the United States to the work that we're doing in Western Tanzania. And this messaging will really be helpful. So thank you for that.
Okay. Kate, do you have a hand?
Hi, my name is Kara Honzak, and I have been working for the last 8 years with the World Wildlife Fund's Population Health and Environment Program. One thing this audience might find interesting, and then I'll ask a question, is just that I have seen some of our Rio draft submissions. We have not been terribly successful in getting gender or population in there yet. And on that note, I'm interested to know beyond Rio, what are some other values that the environmental voice can add to the reproductive rights movement? I get asked this question a lot by my superiors, really challenging me personally to answer them and say concretely, if we add our signature to this particular item, what are we going to achieve? And I think that's a really important question because I've been asked it repeatedly for the last 8 years, and I haven't always had a really good answer. And also, I can see from the data that, 83 or 84% of the population that was interviewed already supported foreign assistance for family planning. So beyond that, what are we trying to achieve?
All right, Kaylee, okay. She's going to come around and get these in the front. We'll get the microphone up to you. Just 1 second. Right here, Ken. Right here and then right here. Okay, great.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and some shameless promotion. We're already doing a weekly television program of an hour on 4 best practices around the globe every week. So there's 127 of these television programs already on our website. And that really leads to my question, and Kate, thank you for opening the door for that. But is there a list or ideas about groups that actually have best practices? We are internationally focused, but around the globe, and particularly in emerging market nations, developing nations, that are combining the environment, addressing the issues of population growth, and then also other issues of the environment, water, clean land, clean air.
Okay.
So thank you very much for the presentations today.
Thank you. Somebody leaned against the lights back there. It's not a... No. They left, so I can blame the person who left the room.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with CNS News, and I know we've talked about semantics and messaging, and one of the things that I've heard is about smaller families and voluntary family planning and smaller families and people being more educated, having smaller families, and also about the negative connotation of control. And I've also heard that it's controversial in these global settings, and I think that's because a lot of people think that when people talk about population control, they're saying, you should not have, you should have one child or two children. I think this is a huge issue, especially for some people. It's a religious belief that they have, that they don't believe in birth control. So I think culturally, looking at this issue, I wanted to see what you would say. And then there's the very scary side of it when you think of China having a one-child population, one-child policy, and some of the things that are happening in India now. So I wanted to see if any of you wanted to address that.
Great. Why don't we do this, and then we'll start with Lori for the next roundup. Okay, great. Thank you. Nancy, would you like to start us off?
Yes, was it Kara at World Wildlife? I would hope that you could take back the findings from this survey to document, to say that you could actually, to your superiors, to say that it appears from this that you could actually enliven and excite environmental donors and members with a message that includes some other issues that they care deeply about and that they put just as high a priority on. And it sort of humanizes and makes your whole message a little bit, it makes it broader, it makes it, it acknowledges the interactions of these issues that people care about. So I would hope that we've given you some ammunition to do that.
Great. I'll try to address a few. Kara, with regards to your question, we obviously spend a lot of time thinking about that at the Sierra Club, is what can the environmental voice lend to this cause, and, what can our efforts really help to achieve with the reproductive rights and health communities. I think that especially now, in light of the sort of recent culture war around contraception and reproductive rights and health access, that we can help make this issue the issue of women having access to plan their family size, which seems like a pretty logical thing to want women to have. Be a logical thing for women to have that is supported by multiple communities and constituencies, and is not, Planned Parenthood versus the anti-choice communities. I mean, I think that those are the groups that have been elevated in these recent debates. It's big Planned Parenthood on one side and the anti-choice groups on the other, and it's like, this is about more than these groups. This is about, people's health and community health and environmental health and familial health. And if environmentalists can get on board with making sure that women and families have access to these resources, I think that helps broaden the conversation and make it more of a common sense solution to a variety of social issues, and something that is just really important for all people to have for more reasons than just the pro-choice community is necessarily putting forth. So I think it really creates the case, having the environmental community on board, and that's something that we see ourselves lending to, and I hope that you can as well. Another question I wanted to address that I think was great was about sort of the cultural implications of this, and talking about choice and family size and what that means in different societies and cultures. And I wanted to tell a quick story from when the Sierra Club was on a study tour to India a couple of years ago. It was actually my second week of work with the Sierra Club, and I was sitting in this hut in India, barefoot, talking to women about their communities and their lives and what they were missing and lacking. And we actually visited an organization while we were there, Population Services International, who was talking about providing contraceptives to women in India and sort of what that looked like, what that meant, and how they went about doing that in a culturally sensitive way. And they showed a package of contraception that was what we would call the pill, and it said birth spacing pills on it instead of birth control pills. And just with that little change in messaging, they were really getting at the fact that, this isn't birth control. This is a medication or, a commodity that's used to help you have the desired family size, spacing of your children, whatever it may be that you want, and that it's really not about control. It's about giving women options. And I thought that just that little language switch was really interesting and good to keep in mind that, depending on the culture of the community where you're working, you do have to be sensitive to the needs and wants of that group. And by working with organizations that are based on the ground doing this work within their own communities, that's how you foster that. It's not, coming in as the Western person and saying, this is how many children you should have because of X, Y, or Z. It's about working with groups on the ground who are already doing that work and recognizing these language and sort of cultural components to make sure that women have access to these services. Best practices for groups that are doing this well. I think you've heard examples of this. Nature Conservancy, WWF, all these organizations are working on integrated PHE, population health environment projects on the ground that have been really effective and successful in integrating these solutions. I have a friend and colleague at IPPF who is starting to work with IPPF on making these links and recently wrote some reporting on how IPPF can really be integrating the environmental messaging into their work. So I think that this is something that's becoming salient with a lot of major organizations doing health and environment work, and hopefully you can speak to some of the representatives in this room of them later on.
Yeah, on Sam's question, I don't know that I know of a master list of all the great things that are going on around the world, but if you find it, let me know, because I could use some good story ideas also. But I think I just want to reemphasize, I think there's a question from Penny here up front, and I think that absolutely that sort of speaks to the real importance of any NGO or aid group to working with community-based partners who understand the sensitivities of that area. Sort of some of the biggest problems you find with a lot of international intervention programs is that they aren't being sensitive to the cultural or religious or social norms of that area. So I think that's really absolutely important. And at the same time, working with, if you talk about an example where they might have some policies that we think are, China's one-child policy that are course of, any direction. The whole focus should be on making programs and making policies in other countries that are about empowerment and making sure that women have the ability to make those decisions that they feel are appropriate for themselves and their family and their own religion and their own relationship with their medical community or whatever it is, but making sure that the women have the ability to make those decisions.
Okay. Terrific. Well, let's do some more questions. I did want to mention to Natalia's question about countries. There are certainly ones that we have seen, for example, in Rwanda, a big switch to in part inspired by notions of scarcity around land and particularly population density, is correlated. Whether this is causal is a different question, but correlated with a change to a very comprehensive provision of services, which has then resulted in declining TFRs. So you have some of the both challenges and opportunities side by side and leadership there, whether that translates into something that could be as focused as a Rio +20 agenda is another one. I also wondered, Jason, I know you've talked a lot to some of the Urongos and what's happening in Europe. There seems to be movement now, whereas those conversations would go in two different ministries in some of the European countries. There seems to be a greater willingness to talk across. So maybe you can connect after and follow up on because I do think there are countries, it's not necessarily on the front page of the website or at the top of any speech, but there are possibilities for that collaboration. Some more hands and questions. Okay, Peter. Oh, Lori, yes, sorry, we promised to start with you. Apologies.
I know we're not supposed to give speeches. It's going to be a slightly speechy question, though. I've been struck for years, I mean, really decades, by the gap between public support for family planning and where our leaders are on these issues in Congress and elsewhere. And it looks like there's a similar gap within the environmental movement. I think this research really bears that out. That there's a huge amount of latent support among American environmentalists for voluntary family planning programs around the world, but the leadership of the movement has backed away from explicitly supporting this issue for a number of reasons. And I think that leaders in general haven't really paid a price for being in a different place on this issue than their constituencies. But I sense that might be changing. I think lately there have been some institutions that have been paying a price for being elsewhere on this issue from their constituencies. The Komen Foundation comes to mind, and possibly some major political parties. So I guess the question embedded here is, do you see that as a broader trend? Do you see that there is, kind of a backlash underway among membership of environmental organizations and other organizations? And I think that partly goes to Kara's excellent question. I think that the family planning movement hopes that environmentalists could be part of a broader constituency that would hold leaders accountable for not supporting something that the majority of people clearly support. And I also can't resist to responding to the question about culture and whether family planning programs are respectful of cultural differences. And just wanted to say that it's important to keep in mind that cultures change. They're fluid. 40 years ago, total fertility rates in the developing world were 6 children per woman. Today, they're less than 3. I mean, that's a lightning fast cultural change. And also that they're not monolithic, that the cultural values held by the village elders might not be the same as those of young women in the village. So just something to keep in mind when we're talking about culture.
Okay. Got I see a couple here where it's coming back to folks, but want to make sure we get those who haven't had a chance, so we'll get you, Ed.
I just wanted to come back to the sensitivities on consumption issues in the U.S. and perhaps other places, and particularly amongst some of the religiously motivated evangelicals and so forth. Is it possible that the whole issue of stewardship, human responsibility, or peak resources, which may not fit as much, but if you look at time budgets and so forth, the time spent on spiritual activities is not a material throughput intensive activity for the most part, and maybe that's a way to get at it. And I wondered if any of the polling or other things touch on this.
Okay, Ed, across the way. And, sorry, yes, ma'am, you haven't. The two of you haven't had a chance yet, so we'll get both of you.
Thanks. My name's Kat Lazaroff, and I work for Resource Media, and we've been doing a lot of work over the past few years linking climate change and population and family planning issues. We also do a fair amount of work training climate scientists around the globe on how to talk about their work in a way that's relevant to the people they communicate with. And the sense that I get is that the problems that that have arisen in our conversation today about, climate change being a controversial topic that we have to be careful about, family planning being something that we have to be careful about linking back to environmental issues like climate change, are primarily U.S. problems. And I'm wondering, I certainly the scientists that we've worked with in Bangladesh and Ghana and Uganda and small island nations, they know climate change is happening. And they see it every day, and they're looking for solutions. And family planning is actually a solution that a lot of them are starting to embrace. So I'm wondering whether particularly Kim and actually others in the room who are doing these projects that are combining reproductive health and environmental issues, are those the sorts of stories that we could be telling in the run-up to Rio and talking about at Rio to help persuade leaders of the developed world, which may not be embracing this as much, that this is something that is actually being asked for and would be an important part of a new sustainability agenda?
Ed?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. You can count on me to ask a macro question.
Sure.
There's a global reality out there, and that is that the scale of the human endeavor today is so big that we're just overwhelming the limited natural resource systems of the planet. And very importantly, that this global human overuse of resources is jeopardizing human development and the options for well-being for future generations. I suspect that environmentalists get this reality, but I'm concerned about the non-environmentalists, or the less informed group of the world. So my question is really to journalism, and that is, when are we going to start publishing this macro reality so that maybe we can hopefully get more people to be called, or to be, to understand the situation and to be in the group of environmentalists that are more aware of these kinds of things.
Okay, shall we start with you about the challenge of writing the big story that anybody will read?
I mean, this is sort of like what I cover every day. I mean, I totally agree that it should be covered more and more often and in more venues. I mean, I think the biggest thing you run up against is that I feel like a lot of reporters who write about this feel like they feel like they've conveyed that, and how often can you repeat the same urgent message, I think, is one of the big things that people sort of run up against. And I mean, I definitely agree that it should be covered more and in more venues, but it's sort of that challenge of making the story like constantly new and interesting to readers, which is sort of a broader media challenge in general. I wish I had better answers. I mean, we cover this stuff all the time, but.
Nancy or Kim?
Yeah, on the issue of what we know about how Americans feel about or respond to a stewardship sort of message. It's been a long time since we did some of this research, but we did a lot of work a few years ago on biodiversity and trying to get the term biodiversity understood and all of biodiversity out there in the public. And I think with great success, the groups have done a very good job of informing the public about what it's all about. It's now widely used, even the term biodiversity, which when we first started on this was not very well used. Anyway, we tested, we developed a lot of values kinds of things around, and a lot of research around that. And stewardship definitely rises to the top. It rises to the top because it has of several reasons, but one serious or big one has to do with future generations and kids and grandkids and all the rest. And it doesn't, there are different reasons why people might care about biodiversity or might care about the environment, might care about protecting the earth, whatever, however you want to put it. And those values may be different. But for some people, it is a religious value. It's the God told me to, or, gave us dominion over the earth, and we're supposed to do right by that. We're not supposed to do the wrong thing. But there are far fewer people for whom that's the biggest value in this discussion. A much bigger value is, and it probably, that those other cultural things are reflected in it, it's just that we're here, we have a responsibility to do the right thing for ourselves and for future generations. And hand in glove with that is, the most important thing to me is my family and the people I love, and I'm going to do what I think's best for them before I'm going to think about anything else. Before I'm going to think about, I'm going to have air conditioning because I want my baby to survive, right? Even if you think air conditioning is bad for the planet. I mean, people are going to choose the things for the people close to them first, and then that stewardship part comes right next to it as I'm thinking about the future and what we're going to leave behind for the people who are coming after us. So it's a very powerful, positive way to talk.
Try to address some of these. Backing off of the stewardship comments, I think it's really important to incorporate the faith-based community when we're having these conversations, and I think that can be a big potential the idea of stewardship. We at the Sierra Club have recently been working with a Unitarian minister in the Boston area who's actually submitted a proposal at the General Assembly of all Unitarian Universalist churches in the United States to have that institution specifically work on population and the environment as an integrated solution that Unitarians and other people of faith have a responsibility to work on. I think this also speaks to what we were talking about earlier about creating this movement, this broad, group swath of people who care about these issues for various reasons. And I think the faith-based community is an important piece of that, not just environmentalists and reproductive health and rights activists. So I think that's really important. Do I think that there's a backlash from the environmental community for leaders not taking this issue up? Somewhat. I wish there would be more. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do here is to hold our leaders accountable for their decisions around these issues, coming from a variety of different sectors because of our investment in that issue for whatever reason, but to really make sure our leadership knows that this is something that's important to a wide range of people. And I think that we as environmentalists can really lend an ear to that and help create that backlash, which, I'm hoping to be a part of. With regards to telling the stories of people, folks abroad who are sort of experiencing these intersections on the ground, absolutely. I mean, absolutely critical to have those folks telling those stories. I think that a lot of times part of the problem is that here in the U.S. we're sort of cushioned from a lot of the effects of, for example, climate change, because of having heat for our homes or accessible water or whatever. We are sort of cushioned from some of those effects. And then also when you look at reproductive health and rights access, while it's an issue now in terms of access to contraceptives, obviously that's a bigger problem for many other people around the world than it is here. So in both of those issues here in the U.S., we are a little bit cushioned from that, and therefore maybe not the best voices to be raising at places like Rio and talking about these intersections. I did want to point out PAI recently came out with a film called Weathering Change that tells the stories of women around the world who are experiencing sort of the cross sections of these problems, challenges meeting their reproductive health and rights needs, challenges getting education for their children, and challenges with climate and the environment, and how those are all sort of building on top of each other, which really should be creating this movement for us to take action on these issues. So I think through films like that and through really raising the voices of men and women around the world, maybe in these programs through the Nature Conservancy or WWF where they're working with people who are being impacted by them, that's an essential piece of really getting traction on this issue, as opposed to just us in the NGO community saying this is important, but really telling the stories of those who it's important for the most is critical. So that's a great point.
I was going to add one point about the sort of leadership staying away from these issues is that I don't think in any other time in recent history have we been talking more about access to contraception and family planning than we have in the last 4 weeks here in the U.S. I mean, every time I've written that word in the last month, I probably haven't used it my entire life before the last that much. So I just think we're sort of at an interesting point in time where something that is sort of generally taken for granted has been elevated to a conversation point across the spectrum in the U.S. right now. So it's an interesting time to sort of find that entry and talk about it in new and different ways.
I was remiss in not telling you about a second opportunity to have a Rio conversation today at the Wilson Center up front. I'll tell you about it now as part of concluding and wrapping up today's discussion. Literally in an hour upstairs, we're going to have another session that has Rio in its sights, a different topical focus, be specifically looking at questions of energy issues. David Sandalow, who is an Assistant Secretary of Energy and somebody who has worked in the White House under Clinton on these issues, has been very active in the NGO world. Reed Deitchen from UN Foundation, who's also working a lot on energy issues, and Bob Engelman, the president of WorldWatch, who's someone who WorldWatch is working on energy things, and Bob is someone who's participated in the kinds of conversations that we're having here today on the integrated questions. That panel will be at 3 o'clock upstairs. It's part of our partnership with George Mason University and Tom Lovejoy, speaking of biodiversity and biologists, a partnership and a Managing a Planet series of monthly meetings that we're doing with Tom and his colleagues to ease that transition. There will be more caffeine and more sugar available to keep you, to sustain you through the interlude, and to make sure you're attentive and alert for that second session. But it's been an excellent first half of the afternoon with a Rio frame. I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank excellent questions from all of you in the audience for a very productive discussion. So please join me in thanking our guests here today.